Let me just ask you to react to these numbers. So 100 National Guard troops have been sent to Illinois. You're correct, though, that the images were of militarized federal law enforcement. But the governor there making this warning to the federal government and the Trump administration, saying, quote, no one has asked for armed military troops, and calling it a, quote, unwanted occupation by ICE and potentially the military, and saying, get out. Your thoughts?
Well, I think this is clearly a vast overreach of federal authorities. There are no civil disturbances in Chicago. There is no necessity for armed federal military intervention, which is what we're talking about here. Now, what I heard the governor say was that the HHS, Kristi Noem, has asked the Department of Defense. I refuse to call it the Department of War. The official title is Department of Defense. The Department of Defense for 100 military members. So whether those might be National Guard, whether they might be active duty, we don't know yet. We don't know whether he'll attempt to mobilize Illinois National Guard troops against the governor's will, which can only be done under very rigid circumstances, and certainly that is not the case here, or sending in active duty federal military forces subjects them to what's called the Posse Comitatus Law, which says you cannot do civil law enforcement. Right. So, and 100 soldiers, good heavens, he can send in 100 FBI agents or 100 more border agents. What are 100 soldiers going to do other than be a demonstration of raw, naked federal power? That's what Donald Trump is after. He needs to distract from the economy. He needs to distract from Jeffrey Epstein. He needs distraction from the tariffs gone wrong. John Deere, an Illinois corporation, lost $500 million in the first quarter of this year due to Trump's tariffs, or excuse me, in the last quarter of the reporting year. Yeah. $500 million. So that's what he needs distraction from. And what better distraction than to have armed soldiers or armed soldier-looking folks with masks covering their faces marching down Michigan Avenue?
Claire McCaskill, the problem is the armed federal officers dressed in a militarized manner aren't any more popular than anything else the general just named. So according to NPR Ipsos polling, deploying National Guard troops to a major city in your state for law enforcement efforts, only 38% of all Americans support that, 49% oppose. Allowing federal officers to make immigration-related stops with fewer restrictions, down to 35%. That isn't even what we usually think of as the whole of the sort of MAGAverse. 50% of Americans oppose it. Let me read you Donald Trump's approval ratings in every poll that was available today. Quinnipiac, 38% of Americans approve of Donald Trump, 54% disapprove. Associated Press, 39% of Americans approve of Donald Trump, 60% disapprove of Donald Trump. Gallup, 40% approve, 56% disapprove. Reuters, 41% of Americans approve, 58% disapprove. The Economist poll has only 39% of Americans approving of Donald Trump, 56% disapprove. He's an historically unpopular president for month 9. He's actively engaged in tanking the U.S. economy on purpose. And he's carrying out an immigration policy that 35% of Americans, which is less than his approval rating in every poll, support. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think he is really... I think what's going on is Stephen Miller has more power than anybody who has his views should have. I think Tom Homan is in charge of a bunch of cowboys. And cowboy is a term that we use in law enforcement for people who have law enforcement power that consistently push the envelope in terms of what they are allowed to do. And I think these guys in masks, first of all, I worked in law enforcement for many years. I never recalled anyone other than an undercover agent being masked. And the idea that now this is normal. And by the way, these visuals are unbelievable. I mean, that visual of those, whatever they are, ICE agents, law enforcement, they look like soldiers to me. They look like they're fighting a war. And that is startling to Americans. What the hell? There's no disruption anywhere around them. There's nothing going on around them that would cause this kind of unleashing of power. And I got to tell you, it's bad for the economy. It's bad for the respect we have for law enforcement and our military. It's abusing the military. It's very expensive. It's not going after criminals. And on top of it all, Nicole, he is driving up voter turnout in very blue places in America. Nobody could work on voter turnout and do a more effective job than Donald Trump is doing right now with those visuals. People who see that in Chicago and in the surrounding areas that are offended, and it's the majority of America, they're going to vote. They're more likely to vote now, seeing stuff like that that's going on.
Well, and Hilliard, I want to ask you to react to Governor Pritzker's pretty pointed and specific indictment of Donald Trump and his White House, and then pretty broad indictment of the bucket of policies, saying marching down the streets, asking for papers, quote, that's authoritarianism.
And I think along those lines, well, listening to the Illinois governor, it made me stop and acknowledge and recognize the fact that there are still more than 2,300 National Guards members that are patrolling the streets of Washington, D.C. And almost in a way, they have become normalized across the district here. As a resident, you see them over across walking by dog parks. You see them outside of the Washington Nationals baseball game. You see them walking by patios while you're eating down for a bite. And so often the commentary is, what are they here doing? Because they're not supposed to be here for law enforcement purposes, yet they're armed and they continue to exist here for purposes that are not defined, other than I think that it's worth referencing directly the Department of War, as their Twitter handle is called, tweeting out this very weekend, quote, their presence ensures order, discipline, and civic integrity. That was the official X Twitter account of the Department of War, the Department of Defense, about the National Guard continuing to be here in Washington, D.C. And I think that calls into question the characterization that, the governor mentioned the word pretext for further action or militarization or the federalization of federal agents. When you look at Portland, the governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland filing a lawsuit here this weekend to try to stop the federalizing of the National Guard, as the Secretary Hegseth has directed. And the president's depictions of Oregon and Portland specifically just don't match the reality. He has said that it's like living in hell, quote, war-ravaged Portland. And he said not just that he was going to send, federal agents to the National Guard, but he provided them the authority to use, quote, full force if necessary.
Vaughn, what's interesting to me is that he seems to have ceded the crime issue. I mean, Governor Pritzker also saying, quote, this is not about crime. It's about a pretext, as you just said, to send armed military troops into our cities. What he plans to do with those troops ahead of the 2026 election should scare anybody. I mean, crime is an area where his numbers have been higher than 38, 35, 38, 39, 40, 41, and 39. Immigration, he's in the tank. He's at 35% on what he's doing. So why are they doubling down on the thing that is unpopular and abandoning any pretext that this is about crime?
Right. Homicide rates are down in Portland. Again, for an example, you can go kind of city by city, and it just doesn't, if you're looking at the crime statistics, it doesn't quite make sense. Why would you direct resources to Portland as opposed to other cities? But that is what the White House is doing. And on the immigration front, look, it was earlier this month that Fox showed on one day images out of Portland that were a mix of some more recent demonstrations of dozens of individuals, but also twisted in with those videos were videos from the summer of 2020. And the president the next day is when he really turned his attention to Portland. And we should note his labor secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, she was actually a congresswoman from South Portland up until she lost her re-election bid this last November. And she was one that was calling for federal intervention. And right about that point in time is when President Trump suggested that he believes the National Guard should be sent in here. And I think when you're looking at the demonstrations that have existed, they've been relatively small. upwards of maybe 100. And you know, I know that anybody that is listening in Oregon, I can objectively say that the idea that the president is trying to promote about it being war ravaged just doesn't meet a reality. I was there back in May, and this is a moment here where the president is using, whether it be Chicago or Washington, D.C. or Portland, we have now multiple cases in which he is frankly spreading falsehoods about the realities of these American cities and moving forward with these, the use of the National Guard, really with only the courts being a potential one to intervene, but in the meanwhile, the courts not moving in a swift fashion to stop these actions. I think Portland is another example there of whether the courts will step in here at the request of the Oregon governor.